now, and Donald Trump says he believes Vladimir Putin is ready to make a deal.
And they're going to be on an air base just outside of Anchorage, Alaska, not too far from where we're standing right now.
The front line did not break, but the Kremlin's dreams were shaken. Hours before the Trump-Putin summit in Alaska, Russia made a quick attempt to advance in Donetsk. A 10-kilometer advance along the Dobropillia-Pokrovsk line was quickly halted. At the same time, the Lukoil refinery in Volgograd was set ablaze by a Ukrainian drone attack. These two developments, the front line being held and the drone hitting its target, undermined Moscow's pre-summit narrative that it had the upper hand. European capitals were clear: no territorial concessions, only security and reconstruction can be discussed. Can Putin walk away from this table with something to show for it, or will Alaska be a new dead end for him? The move the Russians tried in the direction of Dobropillia was familiar in form, but unusual in tempo. It involved infiltration and build-up through advanced reconnaissance teams and small foot patrols, with a reported 10 to 17 kilometers of depth achieved in 48 hours. This was a relative leap forward compared to the meter-by-meter advances seen over the past months. However, logistics fell short, and flank security was not established. As Ukrainian reserves were shifted to the region, the pace of the advance slowed. The common ground between Ukrainian and Russian sources is as follows. Ukraine is managing to infiltrate some areas, but cannot hold them for long. In other words, it is engaging in hit-and-run tactics and not establishing lasting control. In field terms, there is contact but no control. Therefore, the term temporary setback is more accurate than breakthrough. Looking at the situation on the ground hour by hour, the picture becomes clearer. The Ukrainian General Staff announced that new units and vehicles had been deployed in the direction of Dobropillia and that the line had been stabilized. The Azov Brigade is at the forefront of these units. Russian teams in the region attempted covert surveillance and micro-assaults using tree lines, windbreaks, and village basements. Local counterattacks pushed these small pockets back. Even Russian military bloggers have put the brakes on talk of a quick victory, pointing out that the deep but narrow penetration is facing supply and flank security issues. ISW noted in its August 14th report that the line of control and the forward contact line remain distinct, and that the Russians have not been able to establish lasting control in the areas they have infiltrated. The Ukrainian side did not just hold the line, it continued its targeted pressure on the Russian fuel and oil supply chain. An attack on the Lukoil refinery in Volgograd using unmanned systems caused multiple fires at the facility and raised questions about its production capacity. This facility is one of the largest producers in the Southern Federal District, with a significant share in diesel, gasoline, and aviation fuel. Previous waves of attacks targeting the Russian refinery network since the beginning of the year should also be recalled. Every pump station and cooling tower hit translates into delays in fuel supply at the front lines. The circulation of such images of a fire before Alaska puts Moscow's narrative of power through statistics in an unpleasant political light. The diplomatic calendar is moving quickly. A face-to-face meeting between Trump and Putin at the Elmendorf Air Force Base in Alaska is expected. Sources familiar with the matter also wrote that European leaders clearly rejected Trump's idea of a solution that would put heavy pressure on the ground. In the same bulletin, calls for evaluating the possibility of a ceasefire and negotiations appear in the same paragraph alongside the statement that Ukraine's territorial integrity is not negotiable. This double language shows that Europe is sending two messages to the table. No concessions, but if the intensity of the conflict decreases, military-civilian instruments will be brought into play to stabilize the field. Indeed, some leaders seem to have theoretically left open the possibility that elements such as training, mine clearance, and air security could be implemented in Ukraine on the basis of a ceasefire. The discussion of a security force coming out of London is noteworthy as an extension of this framework. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer's statement that they are ready for a package including an air security component, training and mine clearance in the Black Sea, in western Ukraine after a possible ceasefire, raises Europe's threshold for presence on the ground to a new level. The issue is not, what are we sending today, but rather seeking a technical answer to the question, what are we preparing for tomorrow to prevent the ceasefire from collapsing? This confronts Moscow with a new equation between the benefits of the ceasefire and the cost of Western presence. Why did Russian command attempt this push precisely before the summit? Over the past 6 months, a method has become increasingly widespread on the Ukrainian battlefield. Small teams infiltrate forward positions and then use drones to temporarily paralyze nearby troops and supply lines. This tactic targets Russia's fixed and slow-reacting military structure. However, this method has generally been used to achieve short-term results in areas close to the front lines. The application of this tactic further inland, in the depths of Russian defenses, along the Dobropillia line, demonstrates Kyiv's determination to test the doctrine. This is part of an effort to gain field experience and determine which tactics are sustainable where. However, moving deeper into enemy territory means advancing along an unprotected line, which is risky. The image is important not only on the battlefield, but also at the negotiating table. In the context of the Alaska summit and the US's diplomatic overtures, the Ukrainian side wants to show the world that it is still pushing. The move on the Dobropillia axis can also be seen as an investment in media and public diplomacy in this context. Simply penetrating deeply into a specific point does not mean that the entire area is under control. Control and contact are not the same thing. This distinction is very clear on the ground. If you cannot advance beyond a narrow line and remain there, this cannot be considered a tactical success. Without expansion, encirclement cannot be achieved. Without sustainability, supply lines cannot be established. The Dobropillia direction is risky in this regard. The line is narrow, there is a lot of open space, and the flanks are weak. This makes it an ideal target for armored defense and FPV drone attacks. Even instructors with experience from Russian Storm Z units have warned that the flanks are unprotected, indicating that the advance is too linear and vulnerable to flanking attacks. From the Ukrainian front, the plan is clear. Hold the line, bite the flanks, strike the supply lines. As reinforcements arrive, the maneuvering advantage of small units hiding inside diminishes. Shallow pockets are eliminated through drone artillery coordination. This scenario reduces the fear of a breakthrough in the short term, but does not mean the pressure is off. The Russians are continuing their attempts to infiltrate the city with sabotage and reconnaissance teams around Pokrovsk. At the same time, the evacuate and enter model is being tested in the field under intense artillery and air pressure. Therefore, the coming days may not see a straightforward pushback, but rather continuous adjustments and micro-maneuvers. The oil front is accelerating this military equation. The Volgograd attack is not just about the images of fire, it is about the fuel rhythm in terms of military planning. Even the Russian army's infantry-heavy attacks require a steady flow of diesel and oil behind the front lines. Any disruption in the refinery storage pump triangle is reflected on the front lines on a daily basis. This is one of the most decisive limits Moscow faces as it seeks to advance deeper. As the supply chain narrows, the arrival of reinforcements to fill the depth is delayed. Europe's response to Trump's "let's think in terms of territory" remarks is not merely a normative stance, it is based on the broader military logistical picture on the ground. European capitals know that every square meter given to Russia will only serve as a stage for new attacks. The experience of 2014-2022 feeds this conviction. That is why a conditional ceasefire with guarantees is being discussed, not a compromise peace. In other words, before Alaska, it can be summed up in one sentence: there will be negotiations, but no territorial concessions. At this point, the technical question that needs to be asked is, how can the Dobropillia pockets be crushed? The theoretical answers are clear: flank pressure and close-range fire, temporary blinding with unmanned swarms, point attacks cutting off narrow supply channels, and neutralizing contact within settlements through a clear and withdraw cycle. In practice, however, two decisive indicators on the ground must be monitored: the continuity of Ukraine's short to medium-range drone sorties and the Russian side's ability to convert its troop numbers into pistonless pressure. If this ratio remains low, the cost of each protruding arm will multiply. Local successes cannot be translated into operational gains. The Russian internal narrative is splitting into two strands at this stage of the war. One strand seeks to embellish the narrative of slow but steady progress with the depth of Dobropillia. The other emphasizes the need for no rush to victory, but rather resupply and flanking. The second line is more realistic. As Ukrainian UAS FPV and HIMARS pressure persists in the near rear, the Russian army cannot quickly convert its single-line depths into lasting gains. This leaves no map that could serve as a headline for the Alaska table. Putin is heading to the summit not with a narrative of confirmed disengagement, but one of infiltration and counterbites. The Kremlin is trying to fill this void with propaganda and nuclear rhetoric. The Belarusian defense minister's emphasis on tactical nuclear planning and Oreshnik at Zapad 2025 is part of the usual repertoire of loud finger-wagging ahead of the summit. Such overt emphasis is reflexive control, i.e., it aims to provoke the other side into making hasty decisions. The European side is responding to this rhetoric with discussions of secondary sanctions and assurance forces, to drown out the noise with sustainable support and political unity on the ground. While this may increase the defense's maneuvering space, it also raises the social and humanitarian cost. In addition to the goal of holding the line, a difficult task arises, constantly adjusting the snapshot of the situation in urban combat. So why is Europe discussing the issue of military presence more loudly? The answer is twofold. First, there is the historical memory of Russia's ceasefire, rearmament and renewed attack cycle. 2015 to 2021 opened the door to 2022. Second, any security arrangements established on the ground quickly erode without on-site oversight. For this reason, grey area tasks such as training, mine clearance and air security are being kept on the table for implementation within Ukraine if a ceasefire is established. The discussion is not about NATO troops on the front lines, but rather about security and capacity behind the front lines. This has a side effect that Moscow must take into account in its bargaining calculations. If Europe expands its footprint on the ground for post-ceasefire deterrence, the window for breathing space and reloading that the Kremlin is hoping for will narrow. This will amplify the question, what did we get, in the Russian domestic public sphere? In other words, Europe's hardening red line is becoming a parameter that narrows Moscow's options at the Alaska table. Returning to the field, 3 practical indicators stand out for the next 7 to 10 days. The first indicator is whether the Russian side will be able to bring new mechanized units into the east of Dobropillia. Without the sound of tanks, this depth will not become permanent. The second indicator is whether Ukraine can inflict daily damage on Russia's fuel supply rhythm with deep strikes similar to those in Volgograd. The third indicator is whether urban infiltrations around Pokrovsk leave a trace. In other words, are these temporary or permanent positions? If all 3 indicators favor the defense, this will strengthen Kyiv's hand at the Alaska table. What Ukraine is doing here is classic strategic patience and tactical flexibility. As the Russian army tries to advance deeper, it leaves its flanks exposed. Exposed flanks invite UAS artillery combinations. As resupply becomes more fragile, troops concentrated on narrow fronts suffer retreat losses. This cycle makes local pushbacks possible at certain intervals. Kyiv's risk management is based on wearing down the enemy in rough terrain rather than breaking through on flat ground. Moscow's counter-risk calculation is more complex. While maintaining uninterrupted manpower deployment, it must fill the gaps in the supply graph created by deep strikes. As long as these gaps remain, every breach increases the likelihood of a new withdrawal. Moreover, every fire seen on the ground returns as an insurance premium in foreign markets. As the predictability of energy revenues deteriorates, internal substitution mechanisms are strained. The statistics-driven optimism of Russian domestic media is insufficient to mask this operational logistical divergence. The Trump-Putin meeting will revolve around 3 main topics. These are the possibility of a ceasefire, the territorial issue, and the fate of sanctions. The European line can be summarized as no territory. Sanctions will continue until they yield results. If there is a ceasefire, guarantees will follow. The equivalent of this package on the ground is being tested today in Dobropillia. Without consolidation of depth, political bargaining power does not increase. Without political bargaining power, concessions are not made. This is why Europe's recent statements combine a realistic emphasis on a ceasefire with the need to build capacity on the ground. Kyiv's dossier on the Alaska table is simple but solid. The line has been held, infiltrations have been localized, and supply nodes have been struck. The accompanying communication line is also clear. Territorial integrity and international law are not subject to negotiation. Calm is not peace, but talks can begin if the attacks stop. This line is also in line with European public opinion sensitivities. The element of assurance that the word peace will not be emptied of meaning is insistently kept on the table. Kyiv's internal front will have to pursue 2 priorities simultaneously. One is to rigorously maintain the infiltration stabilization cycle along the Donetsk-Luhansk line. The other is to subject the other side to an economic resilience test in the energy infrastructure war. Success in the latter provides an additional political lever for every tactical adjustment on the ground. The timing of the Volgograd attack is striking for this very reason. It is a reminder of the costs ahead of the summit. The simple answer to the question asked by global observers, why has this push stopped, is this: there is tempo, but no hold. Russian advances are measured in the drone artillery era by their depth as much as their width. If the supply flank is fragile, depth does not translate into gains. Dobropillia is a laboratory in this regard. Teams hanging in a narrow corridor are forced to retreat when squeezed by Ukrainian reinforcements and UAS pressure. To reverse this, what is needed is sustained mechanized pressure supported by wide flanks. Today, that pressure does not exist. Let's connect the conclusion to politics. Moscow's "I'm in control" narrative before Alaska hit its limits in Dobropillia. The images of burning buildings weakened that narrative. Europe has thickened its land concession line and started talking about on-the-ground guarantees after a ceasefire. When these three developments converge, Putin's chances of putting operational gains on the table narrow. Precisely for this reason, the Kremlin is trying to expand the psychological arena with nuclear rhetoric and announcements of large-scale exercises. However, this time there is a prepared and coordinated response from the other side. The short-term forecast could be as follows. In the coming week, the Russian side will either try to expand its pockets with a new flanking maneuver or frame the current setbacks as urban infiltration attempts in the media. In either case, if Ukrainian pressure on fuel supply lines increases, it will be difficult to reverse the downward trend. Ukomysevkiat and UAS sorties are therefore becoming calendar-setting indicators. In the medium term, the debate will inevitably shift to the axis of ceasefire or prolonged attrition. If a ceasefire is on the agenda and the pace of the Russian offensive slows down, some of Europe's security force training mine clearance air defense components could find a place in Ukraine. This deployment would mean the price of stopping the war for Moscow. The Kremlin was pursuing visual success at the Alaska table while keeping this cost in mind. The break in Dobropillia dealt a blow to the most critical part of this plan. Ukraine's homework remains the same. Hold the line, bite the wings, and secure supplies. Repeat the phrase "no concessions, only guarantees" every day at the political table, and tell the public there are no miracles on the front lines, but the equation has changed. Depth alone is not enough. Sustainability requires backing, and Ukraine is precisely what is undermining this. This is today's reality. Tomorrow's reality will become clearer as this discipline and capacity continue. What are your thoughts on this matter? Your opinions matter to us. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching.